All right, let's see. All right, what's up, guys? So, this is going to be a super quick training around 3 ways to tell that you should not be, or 3 ways to know that you shouldn't be tracking your food. So, the reason why I wanted to do this is because everything that we do here at PCC is very individualized. So, we have a lot of clients that track their food, we have a lot of clients that don't. And you'll notice that, like, in the testimonial videos that we post and our clients that talk about their experience in the program, there's literally some people that are like, I haven't touched any tracking in my life, and that's okay because I still have guidance with that. And then there's clients who track all their macros because that's what they want and they need to reach their goals. So it really just depends, and depends on who you are, what works best for you, what clicks in your brain. But there are a couple of red flags that we use to determine who should really not be tracking their food out the gate. So the first reason here is going to be if it's making you think about food all day, every day, and it's giving you anxiety, and you're constantly worried about what you could or couldn't eat, what you should or shouldn't eat, what's going to fit in your calories or not, or macros or not. If this is something you're constantly ruminating over, it's most likely a reason and a tell-all sign that you shouldn't be tracking your food. Now, there's some caveats to this. What this can usually mean, because we have a lot of clients that come to us that are like, I've tracked calories, I hate it. It's like I have such an awful relationship with it. But the only history that they have is that they've tracked their calories like at like 1200 or like 13 or 1400. Of course you're going to hate it. It's restrictive, and it's not going to show you what balance looks like because there's barely anything you can fit in that, right? So usually when we come across clients like this, calories are usually too low, whether it's from an app recommendation or like a Noom sort of thing or like a Weight Watcher sort of thing. But this happens all the time where people think they have a really poor relationship with tracking their food because they have done something very restrictive. Now, the story changes when we're eating like our maintenance calories, like 1800, 2000, 2200 calories for women is like typically where maintenance ends up being for a lot of women. So that feels a lot different tracking that versus tracking low calories. But if you are somebody who maybe you've tried tracking 2000 calories a day as your target and you're still overwhelmed and ruminating and thinking all the time about it, then that is definitely a tell-all sign that it's probably not right for you. So that is sign number one. Sign number two is when tracking makes you feel more restricted rather than more free. For a lot of people that come from an upbringing of like food rules, good foods, bad foods, meal plans, all that stuff, typically tracking macros can oftentimes give people the feeling of like they actually feel like they have more freedom because they for a while wrote off certain foods. They said, I couldn't do X, Y, and Z. I couldn't eat this without feeling guilty. So a lot of times tracking gives people more freedom rather than less when they start tracking their food and they realize like I can fit all these things in. I was actually just talking to a client yesterday, and she was basically saying how like she thought that when she was dieting, like for fat loss, that she would have to just cut everything out. And that was her perception of it. When in reality, it's simply just, when she's dieting, she can still have a cookie here and there, but it's just how many and how often that's warranted is different, but she can still have it in her dieting phase and in her maintenance. So when you feel more restricted rather than more free with your macros, I mean, there's a time and a place for that if you are dieting. But a lot of times, again, what happens when people feel more restricted than more free is calories are too low. And this again happens from the MyFitnessPal recommendations. It happens from shitty coaches who give out 12, 13, 1400 calorie meal plans or macros to just get some quick results and see a quick turnaround in someone's weight loss so that they can advertise and make more cash. But what they don't realize that they're doing is they're perpetuating that restrictive mindset with macros, and just basically doing the same thing that a meal plan would do, the same thing that food rules would do, without like with a different framework. And it just leaves people feeling so distraught and restricted and upset afterwards because they were like, I thought this was going to be this awesome freeing thing, but instead I ended up feeling more and more and more restricted. So a lot of times, like, crappy apps and coaches and stuff will kind of assign things too low. And so if you're feeling really, really restricted rather than having more freedom when you're tracking, compared to food rules that you've had in the past, that may be a sign that it's not right for you. But again, I would emphasize experimenting with a higher calorie intake. Anything for a lot of women north of like 1700 is starting to be in like a good range. And that's a very general statement. It's not individualized, but I would say experiment with how you feel tracking at higher calories and see if you can repair that relationship. But if not, like, it's just really probably not the best fit for you. And then finally, the third reason is pretty obvious, but I have to say it, is if you have a history of binge and disordered eating habits and patterns, it's probably a sign that you shouldn't be tracking your food, especially if these things are recent. And the biggest thing with this is just assessing that history with a medical professional, whether that is a therapist who specializes in the area, or somebody who could tell you, like, are your thought patterns and tendencies really in the place for you to be tracking or not? Because obviously tracking your food can be very, very valuable and helpful for a lot of people. But if you are someone who is very vulnerable to falling into those tendencies, be honest with yourself. There's a lot of other ways that you can reach your goals. A lot of habit-based approaches, mindful eating, intuitive eating based approaches that are probably going to be right for those types of people. So if that is something that applies to you and you feel like you still even struggle with like bits and pieces of that, I would definitely say be wary of tracking your food. And if you are going to do it, make sure you are working with a licensed professional on the mental health side of things while you experiment with that. And I would say the same thing applies for the reasons number 1 and 2, low calories plus tracking. When people like start out with it, it typically doesn't work out very well in those contexts. So if you have that history and you're going to start tracking anyways, and you're working with a professional on it, then start with high calories and see if it brings you more freedom than restriction. And like with the reason number 2. And if you can find that and you are feeling better rather than worse, less anxious rather than more, then maybe it could be a good fit. And so I think what I wanted to really get into with these 3 reasons, being anxious, thinking about food a lot, feeling more restricted than free, and history of disordered eating, all of these things are not black and white rules of you absolutely cannot track your food. It's more so like, here's some signs and some red flags that we should be aware of. And then if we kind of cover our bases in terms of how can we like make this as healthy as possible, if you're still having trouble, then it's definitely probably not going to be a good fit. But it's just, these are red flags that are raised. And if they are raised, then you should be extra wary when you're jumping into tracking your food, and maybe try using some mindful eating approaches instead. But this is a fun turnout. What's up, everybody? Maria, Michelle, Elise, how are you guys?
Good. It's Friday.
Yes, ma'am.
Woo-hoo.
So happy it's Friday. Maria, Michelle, what about you? How are you guys? If you can hear me.
Woo! It's Friday. We're happy.
I love it. I love it. Cool. Oh, and Michelle's dealing with kids, no worries. But yeah, this was not intended to be a very long live stream, but what questions do you guys have about any of those 3 ways to tell?
When you're talking about anxiety about food, are you talking about having to take it in, or being limited, or both?
I would say it's probably going to be both, but yeah, I think especially when it comes to just like how most people approach tracking, most people that get into it will download an app, go with its recommendations. The recommendations are going to be really low. And so usually the anxiety comes from like social anxiety, like, oh, I have to go out to eat, but I only have like 300 calories left, right? Like, how am I supposed to fit this in? Or I have my macro targets and I know I'm going to go over if I do X, Y, and Z. So just getting like really anxious about food and worry about, can I fit this in? What can I fit in? Kind of constantly ruminating about what you're going to eat next, because like you're so limited that like it's first in mind. And that's a survival instinct that we have as humans, right? Like, if we are limited on food, our brains are going to be more attuned to thinking about food because we want more of it. And like, that's something that when we go into like an intentional fat loss phase, we have to be wary of, because it will happen. And that's just an instinct that we have. And it's okay to an extent, especially if you're doing it with proper guidance, but especially for people who do try to attempt fat loss on their own and they go really aggressive and they end up just worrying and worrying and worrying about all things they can't eat. It usually just causes more stress than the restriction can cause good. And then we end up retaining water and weight anyways, because we're just too stressed. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. What other questions do you guys have about, any signs you should not be tracking? And anybody who caught on late, you could just rewind, watch the replay once this video processes. But yeah, cool. Seems like there's no more questions, but it's cool to have a bunch of people sitting here. Oh, Gail, do you have a question? You're muted though.
Oh, there I am. Oh, I'm trying to do it with my mouse on my computer and I'm on my phone, so don't mind me. Question for you. So
Sure.
How accurate should the tracking be? I mean, like when I go out to dinner, like the other night I had a pork chop. So I kind of just, there was actually 2 pork chops in the meal and potatoes. So I kind of cut everything in half. And then I estimated what I ate. And then the next day I measured. So I was pretty close. But how important is it to be real accurate?
That's a great question. And the answer is it depends, of course.
Oh, great.
But it depends on what phase you're in. So if the more intentional you're trying to be with fat loss or weight loss, the more accurate you want to be, because it's a very intentional time frame, right? It's like we have a goal, we're working towards it, we're going to do everything in our power to make sure we move towards it, right? So in a fat loss or weight loss phase, you want to be as accurate as possible. That's not to say to bring your food scale to dinner. Please don't do that. But what you did was great, where like you kind of eyeballed, estimated, you found out later that your estimate was actually pretty on point. When you eat out, you have to just do your best. And that's what we emphasize here at PCC is like, you're not gonna like gain 3 pounds over misestimating something at dinner, right? Like you're going to be a little bit off and it's probably not going to cause a huge difference. But the point is you're being accountable. And this is something that a lot of people who track their food get way too caught up on. And it actually causes them so much more frustration that they end up quitting tracking their food. Right. So if you're logging, just know that if you go out to eat and you're giving your best guess at something, that is more than okay. And you're just going to get better and better and better and better at doing that the more you practice, right? The more you log, the more you're going to understand, what does this portion size look like? How do I get better at logging this? How do I get more accurate? Just by just by practicing. So in a fat loss phase, you want to try to estimate as close as you can. And if you are eating out, just overestimating a little bit is going to cover your bases, and just being careful with that. And then if you are in a maintenance phase or you're trying to build muscle and you're being more flexible, then being accurate is just going to be not less and less important. Like you still want to cover your bases, but you might not need to do that overestimation. And even if you go over your macros or your calories one day, like it's not going to be a big deal because maintenance is just very fluid. Like you're just going to go with the ebbs and flows of it. And as long as you're managing your habits, you'll be able to keep your weight in a pretty stable range. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I have another one.
Sure.
So when I make a meal, say it's like a pasta with chicken and that kind of thing. So I put the recipe in. How accurate is that? I mean, it seems to me because there's no amounts or anything that goes into the app. That it's, I don't know how accurate is that, I guess is my only question.
Yeah, so there's like kind of two different directions you could take this. So one is like the recipe, the full recipe. So I'm assuming you followed the recipe and then you just plug that into MyFitnessPal, right?
Yeah.
So what I would do in that situation is I would take the total weight of the entire recipe. So maybe like you put the pot on the scale and it's however many ounces or grams. And then when you take your portion size out, you can just subtract the amount that you're removing from that and then divide, right? So your total serving might be roughly 1/8 of the whole thing, right? Or maybe roughly 1/4. But you can have that math to know like, okay, what is this actually in terms of like the fraction of the whole recipe? And you can type in, you can just create the recipe as one total serving. And then when you divide, say it's like one quarter. So then you type in 0.25 into the serving size amount. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you put the pot on the scale after it's completely cooked.
Yeah.
Get the weight.
Yeah.
And you put it in as one serving, and then like say you take out, but how do you know if it's just a quarter of it?
So like,
wow. Oh, okay. So you take out X amount of grams.
Yeah.
And that would be, okay, I'm with you.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just make sure you subtract like the weight of whatever the pot is, right? So you might want to take that weight first when it's empty. And then, when it's full, the difference is how much the food weighs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So like that's when you're being accurate, right? Or Gigi, when you're in fat loss, you want to be as accurate as possible. Like that's what you'll do, right? And then if you're not in fat loss, this is a great example because if you're not in fat loss and you're maintaining, then what you can do is just like, oh, this looks like about a quarter of the recipe. I'm just going to log it as a quarter of the recipe. And like, you don't have to like get the weights and the numbers and stuff. Right. So that's just the difference. That's a great example of the difference between like fat loss and maintenance, of like the extra step that you might need to take to be accurate versus when you're kind of just chilling.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay. I got it.
Cool. What other questions does anyone else have? Cool. All right. Well, that is that. I appreciate you guys for being here for a quick little Friday chat. And I hope you guys all have a great weekend.
You too.
You as well.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Take
y'all.
care. Bye now.
Bye.